The New York Times describes the oral arguments happening at the Supreme Court today as the, quote, marquee case of the Supreme Court's term. They are considering a challenge to a law in Tennessee known as SB 1. You may have heard of this. It was passed last year that bans the use of puberty blockers and hormone therapy for teens who identify as transgender. SCOTUS blog says the dispute could be one of the most significant decisions of the term, and with similar laws in 23 other states, the court's ruling is likely to have broader implications for the protections available to people who are identifying as transgender around the country. So those 23 other laws are really critical here, and people on both sides of the case are rallying outside of the Supreme Court, as you would expect, for a quote-unquote marquee hearing or oral arguments. So that will be happening throughout the day here. So I'm going to read a little bit from this New York Times article that we can put up on the screen. They write, in the intervening years, transgender rights have become a ferocious battleground, and the culture wars and controversies over healthcare, bathrooms, sports, and pronouns played a prominent role in the presidential campaign. But the Supreme Court has had only glancing encounters with such issues since the employment discrimination case in 2020, which featured a majority opinion from Justice Neil M. Gorsuch, Mr. Trump's first appointee to the court. Now, that is interesting because this is the intervening years between Bostock. So you may remember the Bostock ruling.
Which was Bostock?
Bostock's the employment law that they were just referring to about
where Gorsuch sided with the trans rights.
Right, yes. Yeah. So that gender identity is protected under sex, right. That you are necessarily discriminating on the basis of sex if you're discriminating on the basis of gender identity. Right. It infuriated conservatives, which is interesting because conservatives are feeling really good going into the case today. And obviously they can afford to lose Gorsuch, but Gorsuch wrote the opinion in that case. So they can afford to lose him going into the case today, but they could, is Gorsuch a canary in a coal mine? Is the Bostock opinion a canary in the coal mine for how other justices, who some conservatives have been unhappy with the Trump justices? Obviously, we know what happened with Roe, but there are cracks in what some people consider to be a really strong foundation, obviously, given that they were plucked straight from the list, the Federalist Society list of approved justices. Some people have not been happy with how all of the justices have performed. So the challenge to the Tennessee law feels, there are a lot of people feeling very confident about it, but obviously there are reservations about what you could see from a Gorsuch or possibly someone else. I would say those fears would be probably unfounded in this case. This was a law that was passed by the representatives who were duly elected by the people of Tennessee. So you have that going for you if you are on that side of the case. I wouldn't be as concerned about Gorsuch in this one.
Is the difference for Gorsuch here that one involves children and the other involves adults?
Probably, yeah.
Because like when it comes to adults, I think most Americans, and probably even most people in Tennessee at this point, I don't know, you correct me if I'm wrong, would say adult trans people should not be discriminated in any way and should have all the same rights as everybody else. Now, what those rights entail when it comes to what sports teams you're allowed to play on,
or bathrooms and locker rooms,
I think is a source of contention. But when it comes to employment discrimination, I think everybody would say you absolutely should not be able to discriminate against somebody for that reason.
I think public opinion is on that side of the debate, but I also think, it's because the conversation is so dominated by bathrooms and locker rooms, that's become really difficult as a kind of wall to get over. More from the New York Times here, they say the Tennessee law prohibits medical providers from prescribing puberty-delaying medication, offering hormone therapy, or performing surgery to treat the psychological distress caused by incongruence between experienced gender and that assigned at birth, but the law allows those same treatments for other purposes. So this is where that question, again, the Bostock question about sex discrimination comes in. The Times continues, the primary question for the justices is not whether Tennessee's ban is wise or consistent with the views of medical experts. It is instead whether the law makes distinctions based on sex. If it does, a demanding form of judicial review, quote-unquote heightened scrutiny kicks in. If it does not, the Tennessee law will almost certainly survive. So when Gorsuch surprised everybody by saying gender identity, you're necessarily discriminating on the basis of sex. If you're discriminating on the basis of gender identity, or he also talked about sexual orientation, that becomes the question here. If you are a boy who is allowed to take, or let's say if you're a girl who is allowed to take puberty blockers because you have an early menstrual cycle or other like medical condition that were previously, it was commonplace to use puberty blockers to treat certain medical conditions. and you can get those puberty blockers for that purpose, but you can't give them to somebody of the other sex. Is sex the question?
So I don't think I don't think sex is the question there. The question there is the condition. And the condition that you're talking about there is the early onset of puberty, which is related to sex, obviously, but everybody, both sexes go through puberty. So it's not intimately tied to it. The details of it are tied to your particular sex, but you're going to go through puberty either way. So in that sense, I think it wouldn't apply. And Gorsuch's logic in that case was always interesting, and it's like so slippery. It's hard for me to keep my mind around. But what he's basically saying is that it is sex discrimination because if a man shows up to work dressed as a man, they will not be discriminated against by the employer. Like, just as a matter of fact, like, of course they won't. If a woman shows up dressed as a woman, they won't be discriminated against. But if a biological woman shows up to work dressed as a man, which is how conservatives would describe a trans man, then they might face discrimination. And so a person dressed exactly the same gets discriminated against, according to this Gorsuch logic, because their underlying sex is different.
Yeah.
And so therefore it's sex discrimination, and therefore it's covered by the Civil Rights Act, which was always really, to me, an interesting kind of way of getting to a constitutional protection for trans rights. But I don't think it applies in this case if you're Gorsuch.
Right, I see what you're saying.
Because the reason for the ban is the condition. Now, is the condition that it's being treated.
Yeah.
Now, I'm sure for many people, including me, it's really uncomfortable to have state lawmakers going in and saying precisely what a doctor is allowed to prescribe as treatment for particular conditions. Like that makes me really uncomfortable. On the other hand, the way that this entire conversation unfolded was so fast. It was not very democratic. It was not kind of out in the open. There was no discussion about it.
Yeah.
And there seems to be so much like inability to do it in the normal scientific way. Like researchers who are trying to look into it from different directions, like won't publish information if it doesn't conform to like what they were hoping for.
Yeah.
Like that. So that part of it, you're like, all right, well, I understand why the public is now intervening, because the faith that we put in the scientific process was undermined by the scientific process itself being politicized. So if it's political, it ought to be democratic broadly, rather than in some backroom insular case, as just as a process. And I think it shows that the approach that the trans rights movement took, at which was, and this was their strategy from the beginning, was to go right to the top, like to change minds at the very top, and then from the top down change everybody else's mind.
Right.
And I think what it shows is that's not going to work. Like you have to change everybody's mind. You have to really reach people rather than just the elites.
You have to get buy-in.
Because they had like 100% elite buy-in for many years, and it wasn't enough.
Right.
Because people weren't bought in.
This is a really good point about how there was censorship within, like scientists censoring science in a way that may have ultimately hurt the goal of those scientists.
Right, they succeeded in their strategy that worked, but it didn't work in the long run,
right.
long term.
Right, yes, the short-term games might not pan out long-term. Yeah, I think that's a good point. And this is from the Times. They say Tennessee's brief, their legal brief, said that scientific uncertainty meant that legislatures rather than courts should decide what treatments are available to minors. It pointed to what it said was a lack of consensus abroad. Politico has a kind of tongue-in-cheek piece about how conservatives used to, bemoan the influence of European politics on American politics and laugh about whether we want to import European stuff here. But I think the reason conservatives point to Europe in this case is that a lot of these smaller, concentrated countries with democratic socialist healthcare systems have really concentrated samples. And they were all in. To your point, their elites had bought all in on this. The public had bought all in on this, and then it shifted when those concentrated samples didn't turn out the right way as they anticipated they would.
In those cases, there was a medical question. There was research done.
Right.
And they care because it's public money.
Right.
They're like, is this working as a treatment?
Right. And it didn't.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, it just
initially the argument was, if you don't do this treatment, these people are going to commit suicide.
Exactly.
And so then they studied it, and they're like, oh wait, that's not.
There are some other effects too
Yeah.
that have to be factored into a cost-benefit analysis about protecting and preserving the lives of people who are suffering from gender dysphoria. Extremely real and anguishing condition if you talk to people who are going through it. And so the reason that a lot of conservatives point to it is that actually it is because it's an example because these countries were so culturally progressive on the question that even them walking it back, and it's not totally banned. The Biden administration, which joined the parents and doctors that were suing the state of Tennessee over this law, the Biden administration, that's why it's USA versus, in this case, it's the Biden administration joined the suit. They have said that in Europe, there aren't blanket bans like there is in Tennessee, which is true. They have basically restricted, like even the Cass review from Dr. Hilary Cass in the UK, said that some of these treatments should still be available in some cases. So there aren't blanket bans in the same way that Tennessee has.
A blanket ban just feels wrong.
It's interesting because it is saying that in this case, medical professionals can't, like we have outright banned.
Right.
And a lot of this we can put the second element up on the screen after Matt Walsh got documents from the from Vanderbilt, inside Vanderbilt. The Daily Wire's Matt Walsh blog says Benjamin Ryan is not exaggerating when he takes credit for triggering the Supreme Court case over pediatric gender transition treatment. The Tennessee Attorney General's brief to the court in defense of the state's ban makes reference to Walsh on page 1. In the fall of 2022, Walsh publicized the first gender transition treatment and surgeries that Vanderbilt was providing. This prompted the legislature to ban the practices and ultimately gave rise to this case against the state that will now reach the Supreme Court, and it is being argued by Chase Strangio of the ACLU, who is trans. Walsh got documents from that basically were showing there was like a profit motivation inside some of these medical conversations about pushing trans care for minors. It's just really icky stuff that obviously, to your point about getting the buy-in, it hurt when all of this information starts coming out that there's other motives in that cost-benefit analysis. And it's not saying it's the only motives. I think most of these medical professionals sincerely believed that this is life-saving care, that this is the right thing to do.
Right, and their argument was it's much harder for somebody to transition as an adult than it is to transition as a child before you've gone through the puberty and that sex you were born into.
Right.
But that is an empirical question that was being treated as an empirical fact, but had not yet been answered.
Exactly.
And of course, it turns out that stopping, delaying, monkeying with natural puberty has major implications for the development of your body.
Of course, yeah.
And so then it's a cost-benefit question.
Right.
Of what is the psychological cost of not doing it and delaying it until you go through puberty and adult, and what about people who aren't necessarily sure at 10 or 9 years old exactly what they want to do, and if they do something at 9 or 10 that's irreversible, what is the cost of that, and is it being factored in?
Right. No, I think it's a really good point about the way even the way some of this was explained to the public and to parents. Has it been overreach in a way that's hurt the cause of the people who were trying to promote these treatments in the first place? Because it ends up leaving people like feeling as though the rug was pulled out from under them, and then not trusting and saying like, yes, blanket ban. There's no appropriate way to prescribe these medications for this condition, et cetera. So I think that is an important point. And of course, what they're actually deciding at the Supreme Court today is sex discrimination. It's a different question. That's what the argument is going to be over, whether or not this is, obviously it'll factor in whether or not these treatments are appropriate. Obviously what's being argued by the state of Tennessee is that these are experimental, and that's kind of what we're getting at. If you're not being honest about whether these treatments are experimental, that can factor in. So there will be some debate about the merits of the treatments, but sex discrimination, it's sort of like the Bostock case, a really sort of fascinating constitutional issue at hand. Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.